It was a crisp autumn afternoon in Portland, Oregon, as golden leaves drifted from the trees, carpeting the park in warm hues. Lillian Carter, a prominent civil rights attorney, sat on a weathered wooden bench near a serene pond, her thick hardcover book resting in her lap. She rarely found time to relax, but in this moment, she allowed herself to enjoy the fresh air, the distant laughter of children, and the rhythmic sounds of joggers' footsteps on the path. This brief escape from the relentless demands of her work was a rare luxury, and she intended to savor it. Lillian had always cherished her mornings in the park, a quiet sanctuary where she could steal a few moments of peace before the weight of the world came crashing down. The gentle rustling of leaves, the distant laughter of children, and the occasional bark of a dog blended into a soothing symphony. With her book resting in her lap, she savored the crisp morning air, allowing herself a rare moment of solitude. But peace was a fragile thing, and today, it was shattered in an instant. The screech of tires on pavement made her glance up. A police cruiser had pulled up along the curb, its presence commanding the immediate attention of the parkgoers. Two officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable yet rigid with authority. Even before they spoke, Lillian could feel the weight of their scrutiny pressing down on her. She recognized that look, one she had seen too many times before. One of them, a burly man with a squared jaw and piercing eyes, approached her first. His uniform was neatly pressed, his badge gleaming under the morning sun. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who rarely, if ever, had his authority questioned. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice firm, edged with something unmistakably condescending. "May we speak with you for a moment?" Lillian, refusing to be rattled, remained composed. She closed her book with deliberate care and placed it beside her. "Of course," she replied smoothly. The second officer, a younger man with a stiff posture and a perpetual frown, took a step closer. His eyes raked over her as if assessing a threat, though she had done nothing but sit on a public bench. "We received a call about suspicious activity in this area," he stated, his tone clipped. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Lillian raised an eyebrow, puzzled by the vague accusation. "Suspicious activity," she echoed. "I'm just sitting here, reading." She lifted her book slightly, as if the simple act of holding it would prove her point. But neither officer seemed interested in explanations. "Can we see some ID?" the first officer demanded. Her pulse quickened, though outwardly, she remained calm. "I don't understand. What's the reason for this?" "It's routine," the younger officer answered, though his tone suggested otherwise. Lillian knew better. There was nothing routine about this. She had been in this park countless times before, had watched other people come and go freely without interruption. The difference now was glaringly obvious. A small crowd had started to form nearby. A jogger had slowed his pace, a mother clutched her child's hand a little tighter, and a few bystanders exchanged uneasy glances. Even they could sense the underlying tension. Sensing that prolonging the encounter would only escalate the situation, Lillian exhaled softly and reached into her bag. She retrieved her wallet, pulled out her driver's license, and handed it over. The older officer took it, scrutinizing the card longer than necessary. His lips twitched in an almost amused smirk. "Lillian Carter," he read aloud, dragging out each syllable as if tasting the name. "What's your business here, Miss Carter?" Lillian met his gaze with unwavering steadiness. "I live in this city," she replied. "I came here to enjoy the park. Is that a problem?" The officer's smirk faded, replaced by a look of mild irritation. "We'll see." He handed back her ID but didn't step away. Instead, the questions continued. "Do you always carry a book like that around?" the younger officer sneered. "Are you alone here, or waiting for someone?" the other pressed, his hand resting deliberately on his belt. Lillian recognized the tactic for what it was, an attempt to unsettle her, to make her second-guess herself, to establish a dynamic where she felt powerless. But she refused to let them dictate the narrative. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said, her voice steady. Her defiance triggered something in them. The first officer's expression hardened. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job." "And I know the law," Lillian countered. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." But reason was not on their agenda. Without warning, the first officer reached for her arm. "You're resisting," he declared. Lillian hadn't moved an inch. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, startled. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The moment had shifted. Someone pulled out their phone and started recording. A woman called out, "She didn't do anything." The second officer's stance stiffened, his eyes darting toward the growing number of onlookers. The presence of recording devices had begun to change the power balance, forcing them to reconsider their next move. "You're hurting her," someone else added. The first officer's grip on her arm loosened slightly, though he didn't fully let go. He hesitated, visibly debating whether the situation was worth the growing public attention. After what felt like an eternity, he released her with an air of forced nonchalance. "You're free to go," he muttered, as though granting her some benevolent favor. Lillian straightened her posture, rubbing her wrist where his fingers had pressed too tightly. She looked him in the eyes, unshaken. "You should be ashamed." The words hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. The younger officer bristled, shifting on his feet, but neither of them said another word. They turned and walked back to their cruiser, their posture stiffer than before, their authority bruised under the weight of too many watching eyes. The crowd slowly dispersed, though the energy in the air remained charged. A woman approached Lillian, offering a small nod of support. "You handled that well," she murmured. Lillian offered a tight smile. "I shouldn't have had to." With deliberate care, she picked up her book from where it had fallen, dusted it off, and sank back onto the bench. She had come to the park seeking peace, and she refused to let them take it from her. Not today. But they weren't leaving. The burly officer who had first approached her took another step forward, his hand tightening on his belt. His smirk was barely concealed beneath his rigid professionalism. "Ms. Carter, we're done playing nice. You're coming with us, one way or another." "I haven't done anything wrong," Lillian protested, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. "That's not for you to decide," the younger officer snapped, his fingers twitching toward his cuffs. "Stand up." Lillian remained seated, gripping the edge of the bench. "I won't go anywhere until you tell me why you're arresting me." The first officer chuckled, a dark amusement in his tone. "You think you're in control here?" His eyes flickered to the onlookers, unimpressed by their hushed protests. "We've already given you more patience than you deserve." Without another word, he reached forward, grabbing Lillian's wrist in a firm, unrelenting grip. She gasped, jerking back instinctively, but the second officer was already moving, seizing her other arm. Their combined strength yanked her up from the bench, her book tumbling to the ground, forgotten. The crowd erupted. "She didn't do anything," someone yelled. "This is illegal." Another voice rang out. But the officers didn't care. Lillian struggled, not violently, just enough to resist the unjust force being used against her. That was all they needed. "She's resisting," the older officer declared loudly, his voice laced with theatrical exaggeration. Lillian barely had time to protest before she felt the sharp bite of cold metal snapping around her wrists. The handcuffs dug into her skin as they wrenched her arms behind her back. Her breath came in short bursts, frustration bubbling in her throat, but she refused to let them see her break. The younger officer leaned in, his voice low, taunting. "Now, don't make us add resisting arrest to your charges. Or maybe you'd like us to." Lillian bit her tongue, her heart hammering as they forced her toward the police cruiser. The murmurs of the crowd followed her, the weight of a dozen recording phones capturing the moment the burly officer shoved the car door open and smirked as she was pushed inside. As he leaned down to meet her gaze, his voice dropped into something sickeningly triumphant. "Don't worry, Miss Carter," he murmured, mockingly adjusting his cuffs. "This is only the beginning." Then, with a sharp slam, the door shut, sealing her fate. Lillian barely had time to brace herself before rough hands yanked her forward. The officers weren't concerned about handling her with care, they had already made up their minds about what kind of person she was, and now they were acting accordingly. The grip on her arms tightened as they marched her toward the police cruiser, the murmurs of the watching crowd fading into the background. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into her wrists, her arms forced at an awkward angle behind her back. Her shoulders burned from the strain, but she refused to let them see any sign of discomfort. "Move it," the burly officer growled as he shoved her forward. Lillian stumbled but caught herself just before she lost balance. "There's no need for this," she said, her voice leveled despite the anger simmering beneath her skin. The younger officer smirked. "Oh, there is," he replied. "You think you're special, don't you? Think the rules don't apply to you?" Lillian clenched her jaw. She knew this game well. They were baiting her, waiting for any reaction that would justify their mistreatment. She refused to give them the satisfaction. The first officer yanked open the car door, then turned to her with a mocking grin. "Watch your head," he sneered, just before he shoved her inside without waiting for her to move on her own. Her knees hit the hard plastic seat, and she barely caught herself before slamming into the opposite door. The sharp impact sent a jolt of pain up her legs, but she bit her tongue, swallowing back the curse that threatened to escape. The door slammed shut behind her with a force that rattled through the vehicle. The inside of the cruiser was stifling, the air thick with the lingering scent of sweat and old vinyl. Her hands were still locked behind her, leaving her no way to adjust her position. Every bump in the road sent jolts of discomfort up her spine. The officers said nothing as they drove, but the occasional glances they exchanged in the rearview mirror made it clear they were enjoying this. The station came into view all too soon. The car rolled to a stop, and before she could even prepare herself, the door was yanked open. "Out," the younger officer ordered. Lillian twisted herself to maneuver out of the car, but before she could step down properly, the burly officer grabbed her arm and yanked her out. She barely caught herself, her boots scraping against the pavement as she stumbled forward. The harsh fluorescent lights above the station entrance cast a sterile glow on the concrete, making the entire building feel as cold as the officers who had dragged her here. "Not so confident now, are you?" The first officer sneered, tightening his grip as he led her inside. Lillian didn't reply. She wouldn't give them the reaction they wanted. The humiliation begins the inside of the station was even worse. Everything was sterile, unfeeling. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unflattering, almost sickly glow over the dull white walls and cold tiled floor. They walked her past desks of officers, some barely glancing up from their paperwork, others watching with mild amusement. It was clear that this was just another routine night for them. Another person thrown into the system. Then came the booking process, a calculated degradation. They yanked off her cuffs with a force that sent her arms jolting forward, but before she could even rub her sore wrists, they shoved her toward a processing table. "Hands out," the officer barked. She obeyed. Her fingers were pressed forcefully onto an ink pad, then smudged onto a piece of paper with unnecessary aggression. The ink clung to her skin, a mark of the system she had spent years defending people from. Then came the mugshot. "Stand there. Don't move," the younger officer ordered. Lillian stepped in front of the camera, staring directly at the lens. The bright flash momentarily blinded her, but she refused to lower her gaze. If they thought they could break her spirit, they were sorely mistaken. The older officer chuckled as he checked the screen. "Not your best look, sweetheart." Lillian ignored him. But the worst was still to come. Thrown into the cell, they led her down a dimly lit corridor, past rows of holding cells. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, old metal, and something distinctly unwashed. Some of the other detainees barely looked up as she passed. Others watched with curiosity, their faces unreadable. Finally, they stopped in front of an empty cell. The door was open, waiting. The officer guiding her leaned in slightly, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Welcome home, princess." Without warning, he shoved her forward. She stumbled inside, catching herself on the cold metal bench before she could hit the ground. The second she steadied herself, the heavy iron bars slammed shut behind her, locking her in. The fluorescent light inside the cell flickered erratically, casting uneven shadows against the gray concrete walls. The harsh brightness shone directly in her face, making it impossible to find a spot of comfort. It was a calculated cruelty, meant to make her feel small, exposed, vulnerable. From behind the bars, the officers watched her, grinning. "Enjoy your stay," the younger officer said, his tone full of mock politeness. His partner chuckled. "Oh, and Miss Carter?" He leaned against the bars, his smirk widening. "This is just the beginning." The words sent a chill through her. Not because she feared them, but because she understood their meaning. They weren't done humiliating her. Not yet. She sat on the metal bench, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. She would not break. Not for them. Not for anyone. This was far from over. Lillian's arrest had been as baseless as the charges they had just thrown at her. But the explanation they gave, if it could even be called that, was laughably thin. The official reasoning? Failure to cooperate. That was it. No crime committed, no legitimate suspicion, just an accusation that she had somehow not complied enough for their liking. According to the officers, Lillian had refused to provide the necessary information when asked, had questioned their authority, and had been unreasonably uncooperative during their so-called routine investigation. Of course, what they conveniently left out was that she had asked for a reason before handing over her ID, that she had been polite despite their immediate hostility, and that their questions had become deliberately invasive, designed to make her feel like a criminal without cause. Their version of events painted a different picture. Ms. Carter refused to identify herself when asked by law enforcement, the report likely read, completely ignoring the fact that she had provided her ID the moment she realized they were escalating the situation. Ms. Carter failed to comply with officer instructions, it probably continued, though those instructions had been vague at best and outright intimidating at worst. And the most damning fabrication? Ms. Carter resisted arrest. They would use that claim to justify the unnecessary force, the rough handling, the deliberate shoving. And if anyone asked why they had approached her in the first place? A vague report of suspicious activity. A complaint with no real details, no actual crime reported, just a conveniently timed call that would allow them to claim they were simply doing their job. None of it held weight. But Lillian knew better than most that truth didn't always matter when the system was built to protect itself. She had seen it before. The reports would be written in a way that favored the officers. The body cam footage, if it was even released, would be edited or conveniently missing the key moments. Their word would be taken over hers unless she had undeniable proof. But this time, there was proof. The people at the park had witnessed what happened. The videos being recorded as she was forced into the police cruiser, those could expose the truth. But would it be enough? Lillian exhaled slowly, her mind racing. They thought they could get away with it because they had done it before. But not this time. This time, they had picked the wrong woman to silence. The metal door groaned as it swung open, releasing Lillian from the cold, sterile confines of the police station. The fluorescent lights that had bathed her in their harsh glow for hours finally gave way to the soft, silver hue of the moon. The cool night air rushed to greet her, brushing against her skin like a silent acknowledgement of what she had endured. For a moment, she just stood there, feeling the weight of everything settle around her. She had been released, but the tightness in her chest didn't fade. The echoes of the officers' sneering voices still clung to her mind, their mockery lingering like an unwanted stain. The way they had shoved her, the way they had smiled as they slammed the cell door shut, none of it had disappeared just because she had stepped outside. Then, from beyond the dim glow of the station streetlights, she heard her name. Lillian. The voice was warm, urgent, and familiar. Lillian turned just in time to see Vanessa Marshall rushing toward her, the sharp click of her heels against the pavement punctuating her concern. Her long, dark coat billowed behind her, and her usually composed expression was cracked wide open, relief and fury battling for dominance in her eyes. Before Lillian could say a word, Vanessa reached her and wrapped her in a firm embrace. "Are you okay?" she murmured against Lillian's shoulder, her voice tight with emotion. Lillian hesitated for half a second before nodding. "I'm fine." But the word felt hollow even as it left her lips. Vanessa pulled back slightly, hands still gripping her arms as she searched her face. "Don't do that," she said, her voice low but fierce. "Don't pretend like they didn't just," she cut herself off, taking a deep breath. "They treated you like a criminal, Lillian. Like you were nothing." Lillian sighed, shaking her head. "I know." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "We are not letting this go." A gust of wind swept through the empty street, rustling the loose tendrils of hair framing Lillian's face. The chill sent a shiver down her spine, but she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the reality of what had just happened. The station loomed behind her, its fluorescent lights still casting an eerie glow over the entrance. She turned slightly, glaring at the place that had tried to break her. Tried. But they hadn't. She wasn't broken. Vanessa took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Come on," she said. "Let's get you out of here." She didn't know what came next, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment the metal door slammed behind her at the police station, Lillian Carter had vowed to herself, this wouldn't end here. They thought they could silence her, humiliate her, make her feel small. They thought she would walk away, too bruised and exhausted to fight back. But they had miscalculated. The fire inside her hadn't burned out. It had grown into an inferno. And when the video of her wrongful arrest spread like wildfire, igniting national outrage, she knew she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been mistreated, dismissed, and dehumanized by the system. And she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Lillian had been sitting at her kitchen table, still piecing together the legal strategy for her civil rights lawsuit, when her phone buzzed with an overwhelming number of notifications. At first, she thought it was just another wave of supportive messages, emails from fellow attorneys offering to help, social media comments from people demanding accountability, and texts from friends checking in on her. But when she opened Twitter, she realized something bigger was happening. Hashtag Justice for Lillian was trending worldwide. Millions had watched the video of her arrest. Millions had seen her being dragged away, accused of resisting, when she had done nothing but ask for an explanation. The video had captured every brutal detail, the officer's smirk, the taunting words, the unnecessary force. People were furious. And it wasn't just about her anymore. Her inbox was flooded with messages from people who had lived this same injustice, men and women of all backgrounds who had been harassed, detained, or falsely accused simply because an officer had decided they didn't belong. Some messages were heartbreaking, recounting stories of wrongful arrests that had derailed lives. Others were fierce, demanding that she take action, be the voice they had never had. That night, Lillian didn't sleep. She sat at her table, surrounded by legal pads and open law books, but this time, she wasn't just drafting a lawsuit for herself. She was building a case for a movement. 2 days later, Lillian stood at a podium in front of hundreds of protesters gathered outside the police station where she had been detained. News cameras flashed, microphones clustered around her, and the air buzzed with electric anger. She gripped the edges of the podium, took a deep breath, and spoke the words that had been burning inside her. I was arrested for sitting in a public park. I was arrested because I asked a simple question, why? Her voice was steady, but each word cut through the silence like a blade. They couldn't answer that question. So instead, they threw me to the ground, put handcuffs on me, and dragged me into their system. They thought that would be the end of it. A murmur ran through the crowd, an undercurrent of rage and understanding. Lillian met their gazes, her tone sharp with conviction. But I am here to tell you, this is not the end. This is only the beginning. Cheers erupted. They tried to make me feel powerless, but they failed. Because I see now, I am not alone. And neither are any of you. She gestured toward the crowd, toward the thousands more watching the live stream from their homes, from their phones, from the places they no longer felt safe. This fight is not just mine. It belongs to every person who has ever been unjustly stopped, harassed, or treated as if their existence was a crime. The applause grew louder, a wave of anger, hope, and solidarity rolling through the streets. I refuse to let them get away with this, she continued. And I will use every tool I have, the law, the courts, and the truth, to make sure that justice isn't just an empty word, but a reality. Lillian could feel the power shifting. This wasn't just about her case. This was bigger. From protest to action in the following weeks, Lillian became the face of a legal revolution. With the backing of civil rights organizations, she launched a lawsuit against the police department, not just for her own wrongful arrest, but for systemic abuses that had been ignored for too long. Her team compiled evidence, gathering testimonies from others who had faced the same mistreatment. More videos surfaced. More stories came forward. The system had always relied on silence. But now, people were speaking. And the louder they got, the harder it became to ignore them. But Lillian knew this wouldn't be easy. The police fought back. The city tried to discredit her. Political figures dismissed her as a troublemaker, an opportunist. Some officers leaked false reports, trying to paint her as a radical, a liar, a criminal. She didn't flinch. She had expected this. And she was ready. With every smear attempt, the truth came back stronger. The footage spoke for itself. The witnesses stood with her. And with every court filing, every rally, every news appearance, the pressure mounted. The trial that would change everything then, the moment she never expected arrived. One afternoon, her phone rang. It was her attorney, Vanessa. Lillian, Vanessa said, her voice tight with something unreadable. Lillian braced herself. What is it? Vanessa exhaled. You've just been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month. Silence. For a moment, Lillian just sat there, letting the words sink in. One of the officers responsible for her arrest was about to stand trial, for a misconduct case unrelated to hers, and somehow, by sheer fate or poetic justice, she was the one who would decide his fate. A slow, dangerous smile curled at the edges of her lips. Well, she murmured, looks like justice is finally catching up to them. The fight was far from over. But now, she had the power to deliver the very justice they thought she would never get. And she was going to make damn sure they never forgot it. Lillian Carter sat at the elevated bench, her gavel resting beside her as she looked down at the two officers seated at the defendant's table. Detective James Connors and Officer Daniel Brooks, the same men who had wrongfully arrested her, now on trial for multiple counts of police misconduct, excessive force, and falsification of reports. The irony wasn't lost on them. Connors shifted in his seat, beads of sweat forming at his temple, while Brooks sat stiffly, his jaw clenched. Lillian remained composed, but inside, she burned with righteous purpose. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. The law is not a weapon for those in power to wield against the defenseless, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. It is a promise, one that applies equally to those who enforce it. She turned to the prosecuting attorney, who played the damning footage. The courtroom fell silent as the video of her own arrest played, followed by footage from other victims, citizens who had been harassed, beaten, falsely accused. It was a pattern. A pattern that ended today. After hearing testimonies from the victims, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. Lillian lifted her gavel. This was for every person who had suffered under their abuse of power. With a final, resounding bang, she made it official. This court sentences both officers to the maximum penalty under the law, she declared. Justice had been served.